Matthew Johnson, one of the main researchers from the Johns Hopkins program, is going to talk about psychedelics as behavior change agents, addiction, recovery, and beyond. Matthew W. Johnson, PhD, is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Johnson is an experimental psychologist and an expert on psychoactive drugs and in the psychology of addiction and risk behavior. For 19 years, he's conducted academic research in psychopharmacology and addictions, and for more than 12 years has conducted human research with psychedelics. In addition to his research on psychedelics, Dr. Johnson conducts behavioral economic research on decision-making, addiction, and sexual risk behavior. Dr. Johnson has conducted studies with nearly all classes of psychoactive drugs: psilocybin, dextromethorphan, salvinorin A, cocaine, methamphetamine, tobacco, nicotine, alcohol, GHB, cannabis, opioids, cathinone-like compounds, like bath salts. He's published 91 articles and chapters, with 32 focused primarily on psychedelics. Dr. Johnson was lead author on safety guidelines for human psychedelics research that were published in 2008, very important, and which have facilitated the safe initiation of psychedelic research at an increasing number of universities. He's principal investigator of multiple psychedelic research studies at Johns Hopkins and has been investigating psilocybin as a medication for tobacco smoking cessation since 2007. Dr. Johnson initiated the Johns Hopkins psilocybin cancer protocol with Dr. Roland Griffiths in 2005 and has recently co-authored results from this trial showing psilocybin to cause large and sustained reductions in cancer-related symptoms of anxiety and depression. Dr. Johnson has served as a session guide for over 100 psychedelic sessions. It's my pleasure to turn you over to Matthew Johnson from Johns Hopkins.
Thanks. All right, thank you everybody, and thank you so much, Neil. Well, it's great to be here at Psychedelic Science. This is my third Psychedelic Science. The first one was in 2010, and I wanted to step back and kind of tell you why this conference is kind of special to some of us researchers. So we really, and how much we appreciate MAPS for hosting it. I go to a lot of scientific conferences, and I speak at a lot of scientific conferences, at least about 3 a year, since I began grad school 18 years ago. So I give a lot of talks. And I've talked a lot about this stuff. And, I could be in front of an audience of some of the world's most respected addictions researchers or behavioral psychologists. And, a lot of you aren't scientists. And in those scientific audiences, they get the experimental design, they get the stats. But the stuff that sometimes it's very difficult to convey and sometimes they just don't get is really the stuff that Mary Casamano just talked about, the human connection, the very powerful human effects of these drugs. So it's really exciting that virtually everyone here, they get that. And so, it's really fun for us to present at these forums. So thanks for your interest and thanks for getting it. Thank you. You're welcome. No conflicts of interest to report. Where should I point this thing? Okay, here we go. I want to start out with acknowledgments, so I don't run out of time at the end and skip them. This isn't even an exhaustive list. I tried to identify people that contributed to some of the studies I'm going to show you in this presentation. And I've probably missed a few, and apologies if I have. But it's a much larger list of folks contributing to all of our studies that we've conducted and are currently conducting. But I had to call out at least a few people by name, and I can't name them all, but Roland Griffiths, hopefully you all heard him speak earlier this morning. Mary Casamano, hopefully you heard her speak about an hour ago in this room. Al Garcia, Bill Richards, Brian Richards, Fred Barrett, Maggie Kleindentz, Bob Jesse. These are long-standing and really critical contributors to this research, so this is very much a group effort. It's been a pleasure to work with them for all these years. So I'm going to step back and kind of focus on my perspective on these psychedelic agents as behavior change agents. And I have a somewhat different perspective than a lot of scientists that tend to get into this area of research with psychedelics. So I wanted to take a couple minutes and describe kind of what I do outside of my psychedelic research and what my theoretical background is and what my training is. Much of my research, as Neil mentioned, is in the field of behavioral economics, which is really the application of economic principles and economic theory to the experimental analysis of behavior, to behavioral psychology, understanding behavior and behavior change. And a good focus of that is in drug reinforcement, which is critical to understanding the addictive nature of some drugs, and what we call abuse liability. For example, some current work I'm doing with an R1 grant from NIH funded by FDA is looking at the role of nicotine in the addictive potential of cigarettes and the potential effects of regulatory authority over nicotine on that abuse liability. A big focus of numerous NIH grants that I've been awarded is examining the short-term decision-making that's often seen in addiction. This is something we call delayed discounting, this sort of shortened temporal horizon, which has now really been identified as a common behavioral mechanism that ties together addiction across various drugs and non-drug addictions. And a few of my NIH grants and numerous publications have applied some of these behavioral economic principles, such as delayed discounting and demand analysis, to sexual risk behavior. And so, for example, I published some recent research loading people up with cocaine in the lab. These are cocaine users. We wouldn't give cocaine to people who had never tried it before, and non-treatment seekers, but to see how it would change their responses to hypothetical sexual situations with photographs of attractive partners and decisions about condom use and whether they'd be willing to wait for them, and finding that drugs like cocaine and also alcohol reduce that ability to wait, increase impatience, and is kind of a novel vector for HIV and other STI infections associated with some of these drugs of abuse. Another chunk of what I do is develop new treatment medications and other treatments for addiction. So certainly this exploration of psilocybin for smoking cessation falls into that area, but I've done work with, currently I have a R1 grant from NIH to look at memory training as a potential treatment for opioid addiction in an outpatient community clinic. I've conducted studies on D-cycloserine as a potential medication for, this is a learning enhancing drug, as a potential medication for cocaine addiction, and currently have a grant examining oxytocin as a potential medication for methamphetamine addiction. And another chunk of what I do is examining the effects of drugs in humans. So this is sort of, Neil kind of named some of them. I like to kind of say I study uppers, downers, and all-arounders. The psychedelics are the all-arounders. And about a third of the studies I've published have had a primary focus on psychedelics. And studies I've been involved with have administered over 500 sessions with psilocybin. And as Neil mentioned, I'm not a clinician by trade, but I've been a facilitator or a guide on over 100 of these sessions, and it's been an incredible learning experience, particularly guiding sessions with Mary Casamano, who spoke earlier. I'll describe first a little bit of the history of psychedelic research, and then kind of take a bird's eye view across not all of the studies we've conducted at Hopkins, but the studies we've conducted that I've judged most relevant to behavior change, and to sort of set the stage for looking at our addictions work with tobacco, and then stepping back theoretically and trying to speculate on some future directions or some theoretical underpinnings that tie together this work. So, as many of you know, the classic psychedelics like LSD and mescaline were actively researched in humans as both pharmacological tools and potential therapeutics from the 1940s to the early 70s. And there were promising results for addiction, largely LSD, and treatment of alcoholism, one study in heroin addiction, and also distress amongst terminal cancer patients. These were the two most promising clinical kind of categories for which LSD appeared useful. But then there were the Dark Ages. Am I showing up over here? The Dark Ages. Yeah, some crucifixion going on. Despite these promising preliminary findings, human research with psychedelics became largely dormant. And it's really probably unique in the history of science that this sort of hiatus in this promising research, especially because this dormancy was largely due to non-scientific and non-medical factors. This was due to really an overreaction to the association of LSD with the 60s counterculture. It wasn't a direct result from the well-conducted research that screened patients and monitored them the way that really all of the studies that you're hearing about from formally approved research, the way they're conducted today. So in taking a bird's eye view of some of the studies that we've published relevant to behavior change, I wanted to first start with this safety paper we published in 2008 because you're aware of the mystical experience. Hopefully you saw Roland's talk earlier. I'll say a little bit more about it. That kind of comes with the package, oftentimes with psychedelic drug administration, but so does this. Hopefully you saw Derek May talk about the challenging experience, or what some people call the bad trip. So you got to deal with that potential range of acute behavior during administration. There's also psychiatric vulnerability surrounding schizophrenia and similar disorders. So we proposed these guidelines. They're not set in stone, but they were really kind of meant to start a conversation moving forward and guiding the field. And we're very happy that publication has assisted in the approval of psychedelic studies by new scientists and universities, and it's been well cited in the scientific literature. So hopefully it can help to keep this field on a safe track that's going to protect this field moving forward. And then we've done some work on the delving in further to these challenging experiences. And again, Derek focused on this, but just to kind of say here, we published developed the first psychometrically validated questionnaire of so-called bad trips or challenging experiences. And so if you didn't catch Derek's talk, I'd encourage you to catch it when it's hopefully available online. The initial research at Hopkins, Roland had started the first study before I arrived, but that initial research focused really on mystical experience. It looked at a range of outcomes, but it was really mystical experience that really emerged as the most fascinating of those outcomes. The things demonstrated by this research were it was safe to administer under these conditions, these structured settings. The majority of participants had full-blown mystical experience according to our criteria. And these, for the majority of participants, these were among the 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. And people relevant to behavior change, even though these people didn't come with problems to be fixed, these folks reported improvements in mood and quality of life for over a year after these sessions. So we published the original paper, and then I arrived in time to help Roland with the long-term follow-up of that study. And these are some of the data showing that effect compared to, let's see if my pointer works. I feel like I'm neglecting the people on this side. And actually, it's easier for me to see this, so I'm sorry, I'm going to neglect the people on that side. But compared to a stimulant comparator drug, psilocybin, a much higher percentage of individuals, the majority of individuals, rated the experiences among the most spiritually significant of their lives. And then astonishingly, this remains relatively unchanged over a year later. Alleged positive behavior change. Again, no problems that they came in to be fixed, but we all have those problems that can be fixed, whether they're diagnosable or not. And you see this similar pattern. We've done some work on studying the mystical experience. We have constructed, it was an evolution of older scales, but we were the first to develop and psychometrically validate a scale to assess mystical experience, specifically from drug or other specific acute experiences. So like if you're familiar with the Hood scale, of mystical experience, it was validated not to, assess acute experiences like something that happened yesterday, but, your cumulative experience of these mystical effects across your lifetime. So this MEQ30, what we call it, is the only psychometrically validated mysticism scale for acute experiences like psychedelic drugs. And then we published a couple studies based on this dose effect study. So this is essentially a replication of that initial study, but stepped back and compared 4 different active doses of psilocybin to a true placebo, a sugar pill. And, for someone, we all know the importance of set and setting, hopefully, but, these are drugs. There's pharmacology involved, and there's nothing more powerful than seeing this type of graded effect in terms of, the percentage of people rating it as among the top 5 most spiritually significant events of their life. Seeing such a beautiful graded effect under double-blind conditions. Clearly, pharmacology has a very powerful role in modulating these effects and occasioning these effects. And then drawing across those first 2 published empirical studies, we pulled together the data and then found with the larger sample that, that people who had received psilocybin, we found increases in the personality dimension of openness. And is still, and let me know if you know of any evidence to the contrary, we believe this is the first experimental study that actually changed a validated personality construct and found that it was driven by mystical experience. So relevant to behavior change, and this kind of is a pickup from some of the older work that Tim Leary had conducted. Our colleague Peter Hendricks asked me to help a bit with this study. He conducted a study on essentially parolees who had been involved with substance-related crimes. And once they were out, they were in this program, and there was about 26,000 people. And the finding from this study is that psychedelic users controlling for all the relevant variables were less likely to violate probation by drug and other crimes. And really the censure experimentally here was that virtually every other class of illicit drugs was not associated with the decrease, but an increase in criminal recidivism, really suggesting some specificity. And if you're wondering what, this is Lindsay Lohan, who has had some substance-related criminal issues, but she's relevant because she has recently said an ayahuasca experience has really transformed her life in those areas. So maybe there's some validity to that. Who knows? And some other work that I helped Peter with at the University of Alabama is this very large survey of about almost 200,000 individuals from a large government survey on psychedelics and suicidality. And if you ask the general public if there's a connection between psychedelics and suicidality, they'd probably say that psychedelics increase suicidal tendencies. Well, we found the opposite effect, a decrease in suicidality and improved mental health in those individuals who had reported lifetime use of psychedelics, again, after controlling for all the relevant covariates in the data set. So this is pretty, although this is correlational, criminal recidivism is a really interesting and objective measure of behavior change. So this is exciting. It'll be interesting to see future potential experimental research along these lines. And I'll go over in just a couple of minutes a really kind of short version of the extended description of the cancer results that Roland presented earlier. These are 51 patients, about a third had anxiety, a third depression, a third both, half had tried medications, a real variety of cancers that were involved. Folks received 2 sessions, 5 weeks apart. They essentially, each person received essentially 1 trivial dose that was meant to really be a placebo, and a substantial dose. They had baseline screening, and then they were randomized to receive either the high dose or the low dose first. Then there was a 5-week follow-up to look at the long-term results of that experience, and then they experienced the other the other dose that they hadn't experienced in the first session. We call that a crossover. And then 5 weeks later, did a follow-up there. And then finally, we have a 6-month follow-up to kind of see if any changes may have stuck. No serious adverse events, and just showing you a small subset of the data here that Roland showed you, but dramatic decreases after the first session, some decrease in the low-dose group, but really dramatic and very clinically substantial decreases in both depression and anxiety after that high-dose session. After the crossover, in other words, after everyone's had an experience with a high dose of psilocybin, the whole sample is substantially reduced on both depression and anxiety. And then really the unprecedented thing in the psychiatry literature are these decreases 6 months later that's virtually unchanged. A lot like those changes in healthy normals that our earlier work showed. And then related to potential behavior change that mapped onto increases in well-being and life satisfaction. And these effects, like effects that we've seen in healthy normals and personality change, appeared to be correlated with these mystical type effects. So I'll move into the addiction research at this point. An important initial point to make is that some of our colleagues in addiction are initially confused. They say, hold on, why would you use an illicit drug? Why would you use a drug to treat addiction? So the most important finding to convey to address that point is that while psychedelics can certainly be misused, that is used in a way that harms the self or others, easy example is driving after a big dose of acid or mushrooms, they're not addictive. And we know that at several levels of the way they affect the reward center in the brain through careful animal experiments that are very good at detecting abuse liability. So they're not addictive, although they can be misused. So okay, they're not going to make people mushroom addicts, but why would you expect them to be effective in treating addiction? There's a couple of categories of evidence. A big category of evidence is the anthropological literature that has documented reductions in addictive behavior and addiction recovery, increases in addiction recovery resulting from the sacramental use of psychedelic compounds by indigenous cultures or syncretic religions which use them ceremonially. Of course, these are observational studies, and so they're just one piece of the puzzle. And the earlier literature from largely the 60s, if you earlier reviews sort of concluded it was a mixed bag, that sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, who knows, methods varied. But some researchers, Krebs and Johansson, a few years ago went back and used the techniques of meta-analysis. That's the way to get different studies that looked at did things different ways and used different variables to kind of get them to speak the same statistical language and see kind of aggregating the results across studies. They looked at only all 6 studies that used LSD to treat alcoholism that included a randomized controlled condition. And here you're seeing the odds ratio favoring the LSD versus whatever the comparator condition was at the first follow-up, which varied widely across studies, but in some cases was many months. And they essentially found that across those studies, LSD nearly doubled the odds that alcoholic patients would be improved at that first follow-up, which was an encouraging finding. So we published this small pilot study on smoking cessation in 2014, and it got a little bit of press, and I have to say, that's when things kind of get out of our hands a little bit. We don't have control over the messaging. So if you saw this Newsweek article, this is a really big bowl of mushrooms. I mean, we're not recommending at-home, use for this purpose regardless, but I'm just saying, like, that's like well beyond heroic. So anyway, I'm not sure if these were, certainly if those were cubensis, I don't know what they actually are. But we decided to look at tobacco smoking for a number of reasons. One, I had conducted a number of studies previously in graduate school with smoking, so it was something I had some experience in. And we also figured, also because of that, the earlier heroin trial, which looked promising in addition to the alcoholism studies, it looked like there might be a common mechanism across addictions. So if this helps people with addictions, it should work for smoking. And there's some attraction to smoking because it typically doesn't involve some of the potentially really severe, life detriments that can come from heavy alcohol addiction, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, etc. So in some sense, maybe a pure model of this kind of self-control with an addiction. See, we did an open-label pilot study with open label meaning there was no comparator condition, no blinding. It was really just to test the waters, to demonstrate safety, and see whether it was promising enough to move forward with larger research. These were treatment-resistant smokers. Besides being a good model of addiction, kind of smoking, is kind of problematic in of itself. So here what I'm showing you are U.S. deaths from various substances per year in the thousands. So, that 500 is 500,000. So nearly 500,000 people die in the U.S. alone from smoking-related illnesses. Even though nearly 100,000 people do so from alcohol, it's still dwarfed by tobacco. And then we get to all the prescription drugs. This is all of your OxyContin, all of your Xanax, all your Vikes and your Perks, all of that. Barely a sliver. Let's go back. There we go. And then all the illicit, all the methamphetamine, the cocaine, the heroin right there, and all the over-the-counter drugs, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, etc. So really looking across drugs, tobacco is associated with an incredible amount of harm. That's just in the U.S. We're talking about an estimate of 5 million preventable deaths per year worldwide. And if these were all folks that really enjoyed smoking and, were willing to risk the consequences, I personally don't have much interest. We all engage in behavior that's risky to one degree or another. But the fact is, at least in the U.S., that over 2/3 of U.S. smokers, they want to quit. They just aren't able to make it happen. And combine that with the fact that even the most effective medications that are better than placebo and are good tools in the toolbox, and they're FDA approved, but nonetheless, they fail to help. 70-80% of patients remain smoke-free for even a year. So I'll describe our methods quickly. These are 15 smokers. They smoked about a pack a day. They are on average about 50 years old, had been smoking for over 30 years on average. All had tried multiple times previously to quit. In other words, these were not lightweights. These are real smokers. It was a 15-week protocol with weekly meetings. The therapeutic backdrop was cognitive behavioral therapy, which underlies actually most of the psychological behavioral interventions for smoking cessation. They had 3 psilocybin sessions over 8 weeks. Started with 20 milligrams. They had the option to go up, which most people did for the second and third sessions. This is all the doses are body weight adjusted. I may not mention that again. The first psilocybin session was on the target quit date. So several weeks ahead of time, we said, okay, let's find the date where you're going to quit smoking. And that was the day that they were going to receive their first psilocybin session. And I did mention another one of the really great reasons that smoking is nice to study is that you can really reliably and inexpensively biologically verify self-report. So we don't, we trust but verify. So it's really scientifically credible. What I'm showing you here is all of our sessions on the x-axis throughout the study, all their study visits. And then this is their breath carbon monoxide readings. You breathe into a little machine and it gives you a number. And if you're above this number of 8, generally means you've been smoking recently. And if you're below, you haven't been smoking recently. And this line right here represents when they got the psilocybin. So these were the values for carbon monoxide before the intervention, and these are the values after. And I learned back in graduate school that these are the type of the data that you really don't need statistics to tell you when you have an effect. We recently published long-term outcomes from this study. One of the findings was at 12-month follow-up, about 87% of psilocybin experiences were rated as among the 5 most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. And at the very longest time point, and we actually had to write a new protocol and get IRB approved and get people to consent to engage in this extra follow-up. But it was on average 30 months or 2.5 years after their target quit date. And we found that 60% were still biologically verified as abstinent, which is remarkable compared to the existing literature in smoking cessation. And just to kind of make that concrete a little bit, I really want you to take this figure with a grain of salt, because this is like comparing results across studies with very different methods, different control groups. The only thing I'm really trying to convey is why we are so very excited about the potential, given the absolute level of success rate compared to other interventions. So it just, varenicline is the best thing, Chantix is the best thing we've got in terms of a medication, and it's, at least by the absolute effects, the success rates, it's blowing it out of the water. We'll see if that holds up. But as I said before, the really question we were addressing is this safe? And number 2, is this worthy of the time and resources of follow-up research? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. And so that's what we're doing now. We're running a randomized control trial comparing it specifically to nicotine patch. We went back, Al Garcia wrote up this paper. We went back to that data set and looked at mystical experiences and published that greater success in that there was greater smoking cessation success in those who had mystical experiences in their sessions. Ever since we got some initial previous findings, I think with like 5 participants or so, I started to do at least some small talks presenting the preliminary findings. And one of the most remarkable things for me is that at a lot of these meetings, I would be approached by people afterwards that say, hey, that happened to me, a year ago or 5 years ago or sometimes 20 years ago, or it happened to my friend, whatever. And so, and that combined with reading a few trip reports on Arrowhead, it made me think we need to do a survey study about this and really characterize this out in the population. So we put up an internet survey about 1,100 people, and 1,100 people responded claiming to have either quit or reduced smoking as a result of a psychedelic experience. And astonishingly, 161 of these cats had reported total abstinence for at least 6 months. So a lot of our analyses delved in and really focused on those folks because it had stuck for a while. So amongst those, even though it wasn't required, one of them happened to have a selfie from the last cigarette they smoked while they were experiencing the psychedelic effect of mushrooms, and this is that cat. This is a 6-pound, this is all self-report, 6-pound cat, 1/4 ounce of mushrooms. And in pharmacology lingo, that's a lot of mgs per kigs. So a very high dose. So seriously, I'll move on to some actual data here. What we did see, this is kind of the biggest pop-out effect from our survey. We asked people, compared to other times when you've tried to quit smoking cigarettes, we had a laundry list of withdrawal symptoms. And we say, rate these compared to the other times when you tried to quit cold turkey with patch, whatever. And it was on the sort of Likert type scale, where was the withdrawal symptom the same? Was it less severe, much less severe, more severe, much more severe? On the majority of withdrawal symptoms, which you could largely characterize as somatic or physical bodily symptoms, people by and large, the modal response, that's what I'm highlighting in red, the most common typical response, it was the same. Same as when I tried patch, same as when I went cold turkey, same as varenicline. But then when you get down to what you might call the affective, the emotional symptoms, the low mood, the depression, the irritability, anxiety, the craving, people rated it not one category less, but 2 categories less, as much less severe. Think about it in the context of the cancer results on depression and anxiety. So even though it was all self-report and not experimentally manipulated, we really think this kind of pop-out effects is telling us something important about the nature of the smoking cessation effects and the potential commonality for some of these other indications that are being examined. And in confirming some of that, the older work with LSD transfers to, you get the same thing with psilocybin. Our colleague Michael Bogenschuh's essentially published very similar findings that we found with smoking with alcohol, showing large reductions in problematic alcohol use resulting from this open label pilot study with psilocybin. So okay, let's step back and think about these findings. We've shown you work suggesting smoking cessation may be a target that's effectively treated with psilocybin. Same thing with alcohol dependence, cancer-related, depression and anxiety, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but non-cancer-related treatment-resistant depression, some more, a really promising pilot study published by Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt from Imperial College. So why these different disorders? Why is it being effective for these nominally separate problems? Are there common mechanisms? Well, from my perspective, and this is kind of consistent with the change in psychiatry and psychology, where folks are starting to really recognize that the DSM, the psychiatry's Bible of diagnostic disorders that labels everything, that it's really, compared to other areas of medicine, it's really largely descriptive. It's really not based on common mechanisms, on a real mechanistic understanding of these disorders. So one might question the validity of some of these, nominal categories. And I would characterize, and having talked to all of our cancer patients and certainly the smokers, it really strikes me that all of these are cases of a narrowed behavioral repertoire. Whether we're talking about the behavior of smoking, whether we're talking about, in Michael's study, drinking, whether we're talking about the behavior of thinking about yourself in a certain way, from a certain perspective, whether it's the self-persecutory thoughts and depression, I'm never going to make it, no one likes me, I'm just kind of a loser, being stuck in those ruts, that in cancer, life's not worth living, I'm only going to get hit with another recurrence, I'm just going to be run through this, this constant focus on the disease state, and as Mary described earlier, this ability of that to take over what's truly meaningful in your life. You're stuck, and people realize they're stuck, but that doesn't mean they have the ability to pull themselves out. They want to pull themselves out, but it's very hard. So I see all of this as a very narrowed behavioral repertoire, and potentially psychedelics are a way to kind of blast them out of that repertoire. So I kind of consider all of these addiction broadly defined. And perhaps these are supported by overly rigid and suboptimal brain network dynamics. In other words, this is something a number of groups are looking at, but the findings that the Imperial College group initially reported with changes in default mode network functioning and global connectivity that happen acutely with psychedelics are these therapeutic effects with long-term changes in those brain network dynamics. And by that, I mean the way the different areas of the brain are moving and grooving together, the way this so-called communication, if you will, across brain areas, this integration throughout the brain. Maybe that's a way, maybe there are signatures of that in the long term that are essentially the biological mechanism for this kind of blasting away from these very stuck, narrow behavioral repertoires. A really interesting paper in this field that had really, I think, a special meaning for me given my behavioral background was published in 1993 by a psychologist named Robert Gable. And he had the unique experience. He was a graduate student, psychology student in the 1960s, and he happened to have as a mentee relationship with both Abraham Maslow, the founder of humanistic psychology, and B.F. Skinner, the most important scientist in the history of the experimental analysis of behavior. Very different fields of psychology. And Gable had a profound, life-changing experience with mushrooms when he was in grad school in the 60s. And he asked both Maslow and Skinner about this experience, what they thought, two of the world's greatest psychologists, what they thought of this. Here's Maslow. At lunch a couple of months later, I described this event to Maslow. He said, "It was a peak experience. Although the mushroom had introduced a profoundly novel experience in me, it was not what I had understood by that term. The label comforted me, but it was not intellectually energizing." And I think I kind of get what Gable means here, that oftentimes, and especially in psychology, we can describe something, slap a label on it, and think, aha, we've explained it. We've really just described it. And sometimes that can keep us from going further. What are the underpinnings of that variable? So, for example, the primary mystical experience, obviously very important, and a potential mediator for many of these positive effects. But I think most of us in the field recognize this is probably ultimately a crude proxy for more fundamental psychological and biological variables underpinning that, what we call the primary mystical experience. So I suspect that was part of Gable's frustration, but here it was with Skinner. Skinner's response to my report was even less helpful. Drugs were physiological surrogates for environmental variables. And if you're familiar with Skinner, it's probably not a surprise. It's very kind of Skinner speak. Elsewhere, Skinner wrote, "A drug changes an organism in such a way that it behaves differently. We may have been able to make the same change by manipulating standard environmental variables. The drug now permits us to circumvent manipulation. Other drugs may yield entirely new effects." So Skinner, was probably thinking, when he referred to environmental variables, he was probably thinking the types of conditioning, the types of learning that are typically studied in the laboratory, whether it's pigeons or humans or rats, like learning sort of small-scale events to associate one thing with the other, their response with its consequences. But perhaps we can step back and see some validity in what Skinner was saying. Because for folks that have experienced these effects, the profound effects from psychedelics, or have seen them in the laboratory many times, it's quite striking that these things are not really like other drug effects. It's not like getting drunk, it's not like nicotine, it's not like cocaine. It's more like big events in someone's life. It's more like visiting a new culture for the first time and really having it open your mind. It's more like falling in love for the first time. It's perhaps more like having your first child. These are perhaps the types of environmental, these manipulations that perhaps these psychedelic drugs are more have in common with. And so maybe that's helpful in thinking about these experiences. And so going from there, if these are potentially affecting learning processes in a basic behavioral theory way, we can apply what we know about learning theory. One, still the most widely regarded and influential mathematical model of learning is called the Rescorla-Wagner model. There are newer, more sophisticated models that account for more of the experimental findings, kind of like Einstein's theory accounts for more experimental evidence, more observational evidence than Newton's laws, but Newton's laws still account for a whole heck of a lot, so they're still very applicable. They're all models ultimately anyway. So Biscorlo-Wagner is very much held in the same regard. It accounts for an incredible amount of experimental findings, most Pavlovian operant learning theory. And I know math is scary, and some of you aren't scientists, and even for some scientists, math is scary. And so I want to say, channeling my experience as a session guide, trust, let go, be open. I'm going to hold your hand and walk you through this, and we'll do it together. So, change in associative value. It means how much you learned, how much your behavior is changing because of this experience. The characters you see in the parentheses are essentially representing surprise. The difference between what you expected and what actually happened. And then these other parameters, the beta is a rate parameter, we can ignore that. But this alpha is representing salience. You know, in a study with a pigeon learning to figure the association between a light and some consequence, you know, this might be the brightness of the light or the sound of the tone, and for Pavlov's dog, you know, the sound of the metronome is causing it to salivate, you know, a brighter light, a louder metronome. But perhaps if we think about this in the context of some of these remarkable clinical findings with psilocybin, and the fact that people pretty routinely report that this was one of the most significant, memorable, meaningful, spiritually significant, if they speak that kind of language, event of their lives, is this kind of like taking the salience variable and hiking it up to the 100th, 1000th degree? Can that account for why one learning trial, if you want to think about it like that, can account for change, perhaps for the rest of someone's life? And there's actually a reason to think like this, so at least in terms of those kind of more simple, small, temporal scale models of conditioning and learning, we know that there's substantial evidence suggesting that the serotonin 2A receptor that mediates these classic psychedelic effects, at least the acute effects, have a role in modulating learning. In other words, some evidence suggests that these drugs extend the temporal window between one's ability to learn the association between two things. In other words, they can be further apart in time than compared to when they're not on the drug and still learn association. Perhaps this is representing like a larger associative net. People are able to have more integrative thought. They're able to put things together that normally they wouldn't put together. And perhaps that can account for some of the delusional and problematic effects that you can sometimes see, you know, in non-screened participant folks using outside of studies. And then there was this cat, Tim Leary at Harvard. He had some really interesting things to say, especially before he left academia, on psychedelics and behavior change. So this is a quote from J. Stevens' Storming Heaven, which I'd recommend to you to read if you haven't. Tim was considered an expert in personality assessment and behavior change, which meant he was a whiz at interpreting diagnostic tests, while at the same time he was taking a crack at one of psychology's really big questions, behavior change. One reason that psychotherapy's success rate was so low was because intellectual understanding did not directly translate into changed behavior. Just because a patient understood what his problem was didn't mean he could do anything about it. Too often patients were locked into relationships and routines, maybe that narrowed behavioral repertoire of behavior that couldn't be broken. But every once in a while, something clicked. Even in non-psychedelic, therapy, it just happened, and you couldn't account for why now, why not a year before, why did it take this long, why is it happening now? It was like trying to catch time, that click. So Leary became very interested in, obviously, psychedelics as prompting that click. And he had some things to say about another behavioral learning phenomenon, imprinting. He talked a lot about this after he left academia. Leary applied this imprinting phenomenon to session experiences. So what this refers to is this idea that when a goose hatches, and this was discovered by Conrad Lorenz, the ethologist, almost all the time in nature, when a goose hatches out of the egg, the first thing it sees is its mom. And there's this kind of like special learning period, like whatever you see during that time, it's going to influence your behavior for the rest of its life, so that in kind of artificial situations where, for example, the first thing the gooselings saw wasn't its mom, but Conrad or some other object, it would treat that other person or thing like its mother. So in other words, this was this kind of special time window during which there was this incredible plasticity. There was an increased ability for the environmental interactions to strongly influence and shape the direction of future behavior. Sounds a lot like these psychedelic sessions, perhaps. A quote from Leary when he was, from one of his papers, soon after he left academia: "The 2 or 3 days after an intense insight-producing drug experience can be quite painful and depressing as a subject attempts, usually with some difficulty, to integrate enormous amounts of material into his habitual life patterns. Hence, group support, exchange of experience, and discussion is particularly important at this time." I think what he's describing is what we call integration. Perhaps this is the way to cause that experience during that time-critical window of the psychedelic session and surrounding it to be stamped in to really influence future behavior. And then this is kind of related to a proposal that, in a paper that I helped Dave Nichols and Chuck Nichols with recently published. We didn't use this term in the paper, but it kind of alludes to this imprinting process. We propose that psychedelics exert therapeutic effects for psychiatric disorders by acutely destabilizing local brain network hubs and global network connectivity via amplification of neuronal avalanches, providing the occasion for brain network resetting after the acute effects have resolved. Is that imprinting in brain networks, perhaps? And finally, I would want to leave you with, stepping away from behavior and just biologically, is it biologically realistic that a single experience causes lasting behavior change? Well, my colleague Al Garcia came up with a really helpful concept, I think, and it's very helpful to explaining this, the potential of this to other scientists. And that's the concept of the inverse PTSD-like effect. In other words, you know, if a skeptical psychiatrist might think, "Come on, you can't change behavior from one event." Oh yeah, we know that happens all the time with very negative intense events, such that it can affect your behavior for the rest of your life, and with an identified biological mechanism, such as relating to the amygdala activity. So we're not certainly proposing that it's the same mechanisms involved, but it's a useful model for opening up the mind to understand the plausibility of these effects. And it's inverse, obviously, because they're typically positive, not negative, and it's PTSD-like effect, and they can have a long-lasting effect on behavior. So wrapping up here, so you got the yellow light. Current and future directions. We are running currently a randomized trial comparing psilocybin to nicotine patch, both with cognitive behavioral therapy for smoking cessation. And we're conducting brain imaging in collaboration with some really great collaborators at the National Institute on Drug Abuse who are very interested in our research findings. Something we need to look at is other drug addictions. Currently, our colleague Peter Hendricks is examining psilocybin for cocaine addiction at the University of Alabama. He doesn't have formal results yet, but if it shows any sort of promise, this could be really important. Hundreds of compounds have been explored over the past few decades to find a cocaine addictions medication. There's been no real success. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research have gone into this. So, you know, the odds are stacked against it, but we'll keep our eyes open. But we need to look at other drug addictions. The exciting thing is the potential robust applicability across drug addictions. And then even more importantly, I think, non-drug addictions, whether they're considered addictions or not. What about gambling? What about risky sexual behavior? Or a whole host of issues that someone has trouble, you know, sort of dealing with. You know, they feel they don't have the self-control to make the change that they want to make. And then, as I mentioned before, identification of long-term potential changes in brain network activity that might well correlate and underlie these therapeutic effects. And this might provide the biological potential to provide a mechanistic connection between these cancer findings, these depression findings, and these addiction findings. And then that would potentially lead to, if we found that, then it'd be really fun. We could integrate this stuff with all kinds of existing behavioral interventions. And then I think even more importantly than the direct therapeutic effects of psilocybin is the potential that beyond the therapeutic, such results could potentially reshape our understanding of psychiatric disorders themselves. In other words, these might be such powerful tools, they might help us identify in a very concrete way the commonalities across disorders that we considered distinct. And I want to end, I'm getting the red light now, I want to put in a plug for a documentary that's going to focus, a TV show that's going to focus on some of this work using psychedelics to treat addiction. It's on the Nat Geo channel. It's a show called Breakthrough. This is the first episode of the new season. Ron Howard is the producer. So featured in this are Robin Carhart Harris, David Nutt, Amanda Fielding of the Beckley Foundation, and from our group, myself and Mary Casamano, and most importantly, two of our extraordinary volunteers. And normally we can't share that information with you, but they have added themselves, and it's a really beautiful job they've done with this. So please, on May 2nd, if you're curious, check out on Nat Geo channel Breakthrough this episode, maybe learn a little more about this. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Matthew Johnson. Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.